Hi, everyone, and thanks all for being here today, and a special thanks to the Economics of Migration seminar to inviting me to present my job market paper. So in this project, I study what is the impact of shocks that trigger population outflow on the age of marriage for women. And marriage at an early age has been associated with entrenched poverty and gender inequalities, and it affects women disproportionately. Indeed, it has been linked to poor education, economic, and health outcomes for both women and their children. And despite his huge cost, marriage below the age of 18 is still widespread in developing countries. And girls and women in conflict-affected and disaster-prone countries can be particularly vulnerable to bringing ahead their marriage. Indeed, conflict and disasters drop household financial capacity, but also have led to the relocation of 100 million of individuals worldwide. And the numbers are continuously increasing, as you can see on this diagram. But why we might expect that large population outflow could change the marriage decisions? So first, because they can change the demographic composition of marriage market, but also it can change the perception of this change. Growing attention has been devoted to studying early marriage in the literature. But yet, little is known on what is the impact of shocks that trigger population outflows, such as conflicts and disasters, on the age of marriage for women. So in my job market paper, I speak to this puzzle. But answering my research question presents at least two empirical challenges. First, data constraints, because we need data to track women until they actually get married. And second is identification. Marriage decisions might be endogenous. So to overcome these limitations, I use a novel data set of individual households in Indonesia from 1993 to 2014 that allow me to track the evolution of women until they actually get married. And for the identification, I use an exogenous shock to the marriage market that are earthquakes. Notably, I use the plausibly exogenous variation in the timing and geographical occurrence of earthquakes within Indonesia provinces. So to identify the effects of earthquakes on the timing of marriage, I compare young women from the same cohort, age, and province who are exposed and not exposed to earthquakes in a difference in difference specification. And in the paper, I provide evidence that earthquakes increase female marriage hazard compared with non-exposed to earthquakes young women. But in line with Nakamura 2022 and Ergugina 2018, the threat of conflicts goes beyond communities in disaster-affected areas. It also affects households that migrate and induced by a disaster. So after showing that earthquakes increase female marriage hazard, but also their migrations, I evaluate if the marriage responses differ between earthquake-induced migrants and left-behind women. So to do so, I profit from an additional feature of my dataset. With my dataset, I can identify each household that is affected by a earthquake. I know the intensity of exposure to each earthquake, but also I can follow them over time and across space. But to compare them, I use an additional source of variation to implement a within earthquake analysis. So I use the household variation in the exposure to the same earthquake that lead to changes in migration decisions. But of course, I'm aware that the main caveat in comparing migrants and left behind women is that there might be many unobservables that I cannot control. So to try to upfront this limitation, I include a family fixed effects in my design to try to compare women with their female siblings. And what do I find is that the effects of earthquakes on the timing of marriage mask an important heterogeneity. The effects are larger for earthquake-induced migrants compared with left behind women. But which are the main mechanisms behind these results? And in particular, why we see this large heterogeneity? So imagine a household in a developing country, such as Indonesia, experiencing an unexpected migration after an unpredictable earthquake. So first, migration might exacerbate their poor economic outcomes that were already affected by an earthquake. And second, migrant households end up in a new marriage market in which they have no local networks to turn to. So marriage, or the marriage of young women, can be a vital financial mechanism against this migration shock. And there are three forms of informal insurance that migrants' households can obtain from their daughter marriage. First is a transfer from the groom to the bride that can alleviate their financial constraint. Second is that the aggregate labor returns of women's households can increase when newly formed couples joins the wife community that is related with the matrilocal tradition. And third, marriage can facilitate the socioeconomic integration in the new destination. And in the paper, I reconcile these mechanisms in a simple model of the marriage market, and I provide empirical evidence in line with these results. So my findings contribute to three main strands of the literature. First, it belongs to the research agenda looking at the determinants of marriage markets in developing countries. And I contribute to this strand by looking at an underexplored dimension of shocks, that is migration outflows. And second, my findings add to the literature or to the emerging literature studying the consequences of forced displacements for left behind and migrants. And most of this empirical research has focused on education, political, or economic outcomes, and the majority of them look at cross-country migration. So in this paper, I explore a new outcome that is marriage outcome, looking at short distance migration, that is what we call internal displacement. And given the richness of my data set, I can dig into the potential channels and also look at a potential policy response, evaluating unconditional cash transfers. And lastly, this paper belongs to the literature exploring how households respond to the natural disasters. And there is not research showing the potential differences between migrants and left behind women with regards their marriage decisions. Okay, so what is going to be the outline for today? It's a straightforward structure. So I'm going to start with the setting, then the data. I will continue with the empirical strategy. I will conclude with the main results and the mechanisms. So let me give you some insights about the Indonesian marriage market. So in Indonesia, the average age for women at the moment of their first marriage is 22. And what we can see in this graph is that by the age of 23, 81% of the women get married, and versus only 51% of men. What is going to be important for this paper. But we need to think about this marriage market where, we need to think that there is a big variation in the marriage traditions, and this variation is across ethnic groups. So I already mentioned the tradition of a marriage payment, and 30% of my samples practice what is known the bride price, and there is not a payment from the bride to the groom. And second, as well, is the tradition that I will look at is the post-marriage residency of husband. That is, if the husband joins the wife or the groom community, or they settle down in a new household. And what is important for this setting is that the marriage migration or arranged marriage is not very common for Indonesia, or for at least for the provinces that I explore in the paper. But why my setting is ideal to look at my research question? So first, because Indonesia is one of the countries with the highest exposure to large earthquakes. And this feature allowed me to exploit 21 earthquakes from 1994 to 2014. But how I define large earthquakes, I start defining large earthquakes as earthquakes with at least a ground shaking of at least 7 in some of his location affected. But what is important is that within a given region, the timing and the location of earthquakes are unpredictable. And these shocks trigger the outmigration of thousands of households. So to try to characterize my settings, I compiled a novel data set from 3 main surveys. The marriage data come from the Indonesia Family Life Survey. That is a well-known individual level longitudinal survey that goes from 1993 to 2014, so far for the last 21 years, and is quite well known for the low attrition rates. So how I try to maximize this survey? So why I use it? So it's an Indonesia Family Life Survey gathers information on the current and retrospective marriage behavior, what allowed me to track women until they get married. And using this information, I can build a age-by-age panel data set from the age women get married for the first time, from the age women are first at risk of getting married, that is the age of 12, to the actual age of the first marriage. And I will use this.
Can I clarify one thing here, sorry, just briefly? Because it was a bit, just a brief clarification, sorry. Why can you only track until the date of marriage and not afterwards?
Yes, so I can track women's before and after the marriage, but in my question, I'm interested in looking the timing of marriage. So it means the determinant of how a population outflow, it can affect the decision of the marriage. But I'm not looking at the consequences of marriage. Of course, I look in the paper at the welfare implication and so on, but that's why I'm just interested at the first stage to look at when they enter the marriage market for the first time. And what else I use from the Indonesia Family Life Survey is, because lucky myself, they gather current and retrospective information on the migration decisions, what allowed me to track households and individuals over time and across space. But on top of this information, the Indonesia Family Life Survey collects the GPS household location, sociodemographic characteristics, changes in households, and also the payment that they receive from marriage. But however, using contemporary engagement in traditional norms such as bride price or matrilocal or others might be endogenous not only to earthquakes, but also to migration. So to try to circumvent this limitation, I use historical data on the engagements in each marriage norm. And this information comes from the ethnographic atlas, and the variation is at the ethnic group. And lastly, I characterize the earthquakes using the United States Geological Survey that allow me to identify the date and the location of each earthquake. But in particular, given that I know the location of each household, I'm able to spatially link the location of each household with the ground shaking created by each particular earthquake at each particular location. Okay? But what about my empirical strategy? So before jumping on the key part of the identification strategy, let me remind you what is my research question. So in this project, I study what is the impact of shocks that trigger population outflows on the age of marriage for women. And to answer this question, I combined two sources of variation. First is the exogenous or the plausibly exogenous variation in the timing and geographical occurrence of earthquakes within the same province. And that, as you can see on this graph, there is variation across space and across time. But what I have at the end is like 69% of my sample is exposed to earthquakes compared with only 31% of non-exposed to earthquakes. And the second variation is within cohort age variation in the exposure to a earthquake. And using these two sources of variation and implemented in my age by age data set, I estimate the probability of getting married of women I that lives in subdistrict S that was born at the year K and enter the marriage market for the first time at the age A. In the following, using the following baseline specification. So I regress my outcome of interest, that is 1 at the age women get married, 0 otherwise, on my treatment, that it switches to 1 from the occurrence of an earthquake. Of course, I include...
One question. So it's probable that they enter the marriage market, I don't know, at age 20, but they could have fixed their marriage with other person like 5 years before. Something you can see in the data, or you just see whenever they get married? Because I think it's common they fixed. You hear me?
Yes. Now, could you repeat again, please?
No, like if it's common that people fix their marriage before they get married, no? Like.
Oh, yes. So to try to overcome this limitation, I have data on who made the decision of the marriage, if it's a self decision or is parent decision or another member of the family. So I use this information to run some analysis, and it seems that the arranged marriage is not important. But if your concern is that the decision of getting married was already made before the occurrence of the earthquakes, in that case, I cannot affront this limitation. But what I could do is basically try to limitate my treatment, right? So I could anticipate, but it wouldn't be a big problem, I mean, I think. But maybe we could discuss further later in detail.
Okay.
And then, as I said, I include province and year of birth fixed effect, age fixed effect, given the different probability of getting married at different age, and also urban-rural fixed effect. And my error term is clustered at the district level. So at the end of the day, I'm going to compare young women from the same province, from the same cohort, and from with the same age that were exposed and not exposed to earthquakes. But what are the main results? So to present today,
so there's a question.
One burning question.
Just
a clarification. So do you only consider an earthquake happening once, right? So if you will suffer from multiple earthquakes, this is something that is not important in your analysis, if I understand correctly, right? And so some of the women, right? So some of the women that are sort of your counterfactual, right, will experience an earthquake in the future as well, right?
Yes. Shall I answer now?
So I'm just trying to understand this, and I'm just thinking to which extent, so how this is different from a setting in which you have people either experiencing an earthquake or not, and the control group will never experience an earthquake.
Yes. So for answering the first question, so I start defining my treatment as the occurrence of a earthquake. But then in the paper, I use the exposure to multiple earthquakes. But let me tell you that only 2% of my sample is exposed to more than one large earthquake. And coming to the second question, that is about the contrafactual, you are right. So in my contrafactual are never exposed and later exposed to earthquakes. But what we will see is that if we restrict to never exposed to, and we remove the later treated, and we compare only treated versus never treated, the results will not change. That is the main concern. Okay, but thanks for the question. So how am I going to present the results today? So I'm going to go first to how earthquakes affect marriage, then how earthquakes affect the migration decisions, and I will end up looking at the heterogeneity, how the marriage decisions change between earthquake-induced migrants and left-behind women. So what I present in the paper is that women that are exposed to earthquake from the age of 12 to the age of 22, they are 0.7 more likely to get married the same year. And the effects are significant at the 5% level. And when I restrict my panel dimension to the age below 18, what we can see is that the results are consistent, but the magnitude of the effects correspond to a 44% in the annual marriage hazard, what is quite sizable. But the main identification assumptions of these results is that in the absence of the treatment, women exposed and not exposed to earthquake might evolve similarly. So to provide evidence of the parallel trends assumption, I estimate an event study or a version of my baseline specification that allows the effect to vary over time. And what we can see is that there is not effects during the 5 years leading up the earthquakes, but after that, this event study is becoming not significant, and the main reason for that is because the never exposed to earthquakes are not included. But when we see the effects overall and not in the event study, it seems that the effect starts after the age after the 3rd year, right? So it will be after the 4th year. Okay, and I ran a bunch of robustness tests that I'm not going to present today. But let me just jump to the migration decisions. So to do so,
there's another question by Martin. Oh, no, he lowered his hand.
No, I can't wait. I just wanted to understand better the dip of the coefficient and the rebound and whether the effects compensate each other or whatever, but we can discuss about that later.
Yes, so maybe Martin, you wouldn't mind if we go through this question later? Yes? Okay, so as I said, to study how earthquakes affect migration decisions, I conduct a within earthquake analysis, because as I said, there is a household variation in how its household was exposed to the same earthquake. So what I find is that earthquakes increase the migration probability by 49% compared to the baseline mean, and the migration decisions increase with the earthquake exposure. So, and how I define earthquake exposure, so is it increases, there is a positive relationship with the ground shaking, and there is a negative relationship with the distance to the earthquake epicenter. And what is important is not that it's not a gender or an ethnicity or a religion induced migration. So it's affecting everyone in the earthquake affected area. And what about the heterogeneity?
Laura, just one question. It's about whole household migration. Like, it's not about split household or dissolution of the household that was impacted by the earthquake. It's just about whole household migration, right?
So if the question is if we might expect that a household is split in 2 or 3 after the disaster, so it's not very common. This to say that given that I'm interested in looking at the behavior of young women, they do not move alone. So they move with the head of household or with one of their parents. So so just to answer your question, no, it's not very common to see this the split in the household. And so let me jump to the heterogeneity. So as I said, the threat goes beyond earthquake affected areas. It also affects migrants induced by this shock. So the effects are larger among earthquake-induced migrants. But as I said, there might be an important threat when we compare migrants versus left-behind women. So I incorporate a family fixed effect into the design, that is using the baseline specification that I already presented. And the idea is as follows. So let me give you an example. So imagine an earthquake in 2018 where there are 2 daughters in one family, and both they were affected by the earthquake. So one was 23, and the second daughter was 16. So what I'm going to do, given that I have retrospective and current information of their marriages or in their marriage behavior, I'm going to compare them age by age. And what we can see is that the effects are consistent with when we compare migrants versus left behind women, and the magnitude of the effect increases. But what is important is that this approach allows me to account for regional characteristics at the moment of the birth, but also place of residence, and allow me to control for important characteristics for the marriage market that are religion, culture, and family attributes.
Laura, sorry, one thing.
Yeah, okay. No,
Apologies, sorry.
Just another question, just to know if you have you don't have this information for non-co-resident sisters. So if non-co-resident sisters are already married, I know that there is a module for the first wave when you have information about non-co-resident sibling, but the age at marriage will be missing. So you will just have a partial vision of the siblings.
No, I mean, because I know the identifier of the mother or the father, so I'm able to track them even they move to another household.
Yeah, but what if they were not there since the first wave?
Okay, so if they were not from the first, so I haven't mentioned it. So in my sample, I restrict to women that were at least 30 years old at the moment of, that they were at least at least 30 years old in the last round. And that's the main idea, because I want to make sure that they were interviewed from the moment 1993 until the 2014, right? So I want to make sure that they were already 12 years old when we are in the first wave, that is in 1993. So it shouldn't be a problem.
It should, yeah, okay. As I understand, it should not be a problem. The only problem might be just child fostering if they are not living with the parent during the teenager period. But which happening in Indonesia actually. Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Okay, yes. So then that's where, I mean, of course, I mean, I might agree that the subsample of girl-to-girl comparison is a selection of the sample. So I rely on the first comparison, migrants and left behind women, and then I continue with the female sibling comparison to try to overcome the limitation, right? But I completely agree. This is a limitation. Okay, and let me just end up with the last part of today's presentation, that is the mechanisms. So to do so, I'm going to first go through the potential channels that could explain the effects for earthquake-induced migrants, and I will end up with the mechanisms for the left behind women. So as I said, unexpected migration after an unpredictable earthquake, it leads to a drop in the financial capacity, but also it decreases the local networks at the new destination. So marriage can be a vital mechanism against the migration shock. And I propose 3 forms of informal insurance that migrants' households can obtain from their daughters' marriage. First is a transfer from the groom to the bride, as I said already, that can potentially alleviate the credit constraint. And the second one is related with the matrilocal tradition, where the aggregate labor returns in the woman's households can increase when a new member, that is the future son-in-law, joins the wife community. And to test for these mechanisms, I use data from the ethnographic atlas that allow me to capture the within-country variation in the traditional engagement of these 2 potential informal insurance. That is the transfer at the moment of the marriage and the arrival of a new member in the wife's household. And what I find is that the magnitude of the effects is 44% higher among bride price women compared with non-bride price women. And the same with the matrilocal, that is 7 times higher among matrilocal households or matrilocal women compared with non-matrilocal women. That in
Laura,
that case,
you have 5 minutes left.
Perfect. I'm almost done. But of course, I mean, I can run this heterogeneity, including a dummy interaction instead of by subsample, and we will find the same results. Perfect. And what about the last mechanism? Because I also said that marriage can facilitate the socioeconomic integration at the new destination. So to test for this hypothesis, I use Indonesia Family Life Survey data on the current engagement at the new destination. So what I find is that the community engagement at the new destination decreases the effects of earthquakes decreases the heterogeneity between migrants and left behind women by 12%. And the intuition of these results is that the opposite will happen when migrant households are poorly integrated at the new destination. So if they are poorly integrated at the new destination, they might increase their effects, okay? And to provide further evidence of these results, I look at how households react to monetary incentive using unconditional cash transfers. That I saw that unconditional cash transfer mitigate the effects. But what about left behind women? So I cannot find the same results for left behind women. This to say that it seems that the effects for left behind women are driven by a response to a supply shock. So first is that large population outflows that do not affect the sex ratio increase women's preferences for an early marriage rather than risking not finding a good match in the future. And the second one is that earthquakes might lead to the destructions of infrastructures and amenities. So just think about the school destructions that affects schooling negatively. And as a consequence, as a substitution effect, there is an increase in the marriage below the age of 18. So what I show you today. So the main takeaway is that destructive events, in particular earthquakes, increase the female marriage hazard. And the effects are sizable and concentrated below the age of 18. But there is an important heterogeneity because the effects are larger for migrant women, because they have to respond to an additional shock that is their own migration. And there are some policy implications that emerge from these findings. First is that showing the crucial implications of population outflows for left behind women, that they are also affected by large movement of population. Second, looking at how unconditional transfer can mitigate the effects, I helped to uncover which potential policy could combat the consequences of forced displacement. And third, I highlight the importance of culture in shaping the economic behavior of a displaced population. So in the future, I'm looking forward to continue this research agenda and expanding to the intergenerational implications of these shocks, looking at the marriage decisions on Native women. And in particular, I'm interested in expanding to new outcomes as bargaining power, the engagement in cultural norms, but also marriage matching. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Okay, so thank you, Laura, for the nice presentation. And now Alex Yarkin can present his discussion of the paper. You have 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, sorry, you'll need to allow me to share the screen. All right.
Now you should be able.
Yep. So can you see the screen? All right. So thanks a lot, Laura. It's super interesting paper. I really learned a lot. It's a huge exercise, very detailed, and it was really great to read. I think it's like it has like all the three components that we often think of, basically creating a great paper. So it's an important question, rich data, and nice research design. So it's all great. I'm a bit of an outsider to this particular subfield of marriage norms, and so take it with a grain of salt. Okay, I think the three main contributions for me are basically the effect of displacement on the marriage market. Okay, both at the origin and at destination. I think at destination is much more interesting and strong results. Okay, I think the part that goes to the origin effects, I think it's a bit less interesting. So I would discuss this at the end. Maybe it's even worse to reframe a little bit the paper, but it's of course just my thoughts. So I think it's also great that you combine these various data sets where basically some of this kind of deep-rooted cultural traits, what are the traditions, what is the kinship structure with kind of modern shocks. I think we need more papers that do that, and it's great that you invest in this direction. I think I know just a few papers that do that. And of course, I think this interplay between basically marriage and network formation is very interesting. And I would love to see more of this analysis in the paper. I think you just touch upon it at the end. And I understand why, because you need to do the identification and all, but I think this is a very interesting part, and it would be nice to see more. Now, some comments, and again, the paper is very long, so I'm sure that many of my comments are addressed somewhere in the paper. So, but here it goes. Starting with the few identification thoughts. Again, maybe they are already addressed, and then some thoughts on the mechanisms and contribution and so on. Okay, so starting with the identification, I think the shock itself, the earthquake shock, is pretty exogenous, and it's hard to, it's pretty believable. Okay, the movement is not. Okay, so I would love to see more discussion in section 4 on why people move or not. Okay, do people move with the entire household, for example? Okay, or within a given community, who moves or who stays? All right, if there are correlations with marriage potential or income potential or whatever other covariates, it can introduce additional questions. But I'm not sure if it's that crucial, but I think it would be good to discuss it more, because the key shock, of course, is exogenous, right? So that's good, but the movement shock is not exogenous, so that's fun. Then, of course, return migration. Okay, if you are not successful in your new place, do you go back? Okay, could be marriage success, could be labor market success, or whatever, amenity match. I don't know. In this migration literature, there are many factors that can affect migration decision, right? And this is a reason why I think you should track people after migration as well. Okay. And yeah, I don't know, that's a bit of a minor thing for me, but where people actually go. I did not find much of a discussion of this. So if there is any sorting on this margin, it would be good to discuss that. Yeah, if there is no sorting, fine. Now, regarding the story and the mechanisms, who do women marry? Okay, I think there was a related question on that during the presentation. Do they just marry the same people from their origin communities, but just earlier? Then it's not such a big deal, right? And basically, well, I mean, maybe it is. Or if they marry people at destination, right? Then why? Right? Why do men want to marry necessarily these women and so on? So how do incentives work in this case? Okay, maybe I don't know if it's possible to answer this, but it's interesting for me. Do they divorce later on at the greater rates? All right, because if it's the necessity marriage, again, that's an additional reason to track people after marriage, because if they do divorce, I think it's a slightly different story. Okay, and by the way, I will send you the slides. So just then from the paper, it seemed like both migrating after the earthquake and marrying after migration are actually pretty bad decisions. Okay, in the sense that people do not actually end up winning from these decisions. Then the question, why is it happening, right? So maybe there is some other part of the story that we're missing, right? That people migrate, they end up worse than those who stay, apparently, right? People marry, it also does not help, in terms of incomes and life trajectories. Is it just myopic behavior or what? So it would just, as a discussion, it would, I think, be interesting. Then sevenfold increase in this matrilocal interaction is a lot, right? And it would be nice to know why the effect is so large. Okay, so I think it's important. And remittances as a final part of the story, I don't think you discussed that. And at the end, I was just thinking, that maybe if part of the households is still there at the origin, maybe people move because they want to support those who left behind or something like that. So it would be nice, at least to acknowledge that this could be the story. Maybe there is some data even, I don't know, on this. All right. Now, regarding the recent literature, as I said, I don't know much in this literature, but I think there are a few papers by Ashraf and by Robertson showing that basically matrilocal and bright price, they can actually be helpful sometimes, as promoting education, because it increases incentives to educate the girl child, right? And so in this paper, it's more like a negative effect in a sense, right? Because this bright price and matrilocality, they kind of push you to marry after the shock, right? So in a sense, maybe you can pose your paper as as this kind of giving alternative evidence to these papers. And this paper, the recent one by Bargain, Olivier Bargain, it shows that matrilocal correlates with positively with many things like, gender norms, divorce rates, control over fertility. And this is, again, why I thought that maybe you want to track people after they get married, okay? Maybe you can also discuss these things. And then there is this broader literature, right, on basically migration, exposure to new networks. And I think it's especially this part on migration and network building, how marriage can help. It's an interesting, very interesting agenda where maybe you can contribute now. Specifics of the Indonesian case, okay? Maybe you can discuss how generalizable the context is. I think the matrilocal norms are quite prevalent, at least that's what I read in these other papers, like 40–50% practice this. So, what about other societies? Maybe it should reverse. I was just thinking, I don't know the results. Then other types of shocks, right? Is there anything specific to earthquakes? I thought that not necessarily, right? That basically your story is more about displacement generally. It could be any kind of disaster that pushes people out, right? And so, again, maybe this can allow you to generalize somehow. And whatever, some other questions. And then an interesting part is just my suggestion, how maybe you can frame the paper a little bit differently, okay? So your contribution, your question is the impact of shocks that trigger outflows on the age of marriage for women, okay? So three parts here, starting with shocks. I think that the broader contribution is not the effect of shocks, okay? Shocks are just the instrument in this paper for you. I think your actual question is the effect of displacement on marriage, okay? The effect of displacement on the marriage market, basically. These shocks are basically just an exposure, just like the IV, if you wish, for you, okay? Something that creates this displacement, okay? And as I was saying before, I'm not sure it's important that this is like an earthquake or not, especially given that the results are much stronger for movers than for stayers, okay? Then I think that maybe you can extend your contribution beyond the age of marriage, right? Because I think the broader question is how, early marriage affects life trajectories, okay? You mentioned it's a super important question, and basically this paper gives you an exogenous shock to early marriage, okay? So maybe adding this dimension could be cool as well. And finally, what is the impact on men and on the efficiency of the marriage market overall? Because, if women marry earlier, they are not marrying into vacuum, right? They're marrying someone. And so apparently men also marry earlier, right? How does it affect the efficiency of the marriage market overall? How does it affect maybe the distribution of power between men and women, all right? Maybe it exacerbates inequality, or maybe not, I don't know. So I think you can quite easily extend and broaden the contribution, basically. And overall, super, super interesting. And I think that's much, much more potential going forward. So thanks a lot.
Great, Alexander. It was an awesome discussion. I think it will be very useful. So I think now we can open the floor for questions. And I see there's already one question from Martin. So I think, Laura, if you want, you can hear some questions and then reply. And reply also to Alex whenever you would finish. Okay, so you can speak now, Martin. And
Alex already stole most of my comments, but I still like something that he suggested. I think is very important is this thing of like where people go and who they marry, right? And I think that one important aspect, you stress this mechanism of like the integration, but for me, the marriage market destination is something that seems quite relevant, that is not sufficiently discussed, right? So whether these people, so do they have a Thai marriage market? Do they have people from their own ethnic group at destination, right? All these stories, I think are quite interesting. But yeah, as he said, this is like really like a paper with a lot of potential. So you can, yeah, you have to do it shorter, but you have to do it more attractive.
Yeah, I mean, can I answer now, maybe, Lucas?
Yeah, sure, you go.
Yeah, I mean, thanks all for the comments. So let me say, so about the movement. So I know the destination, and in the paper I present how the effects could change when one destination is more affected than the other. What about the distance? What about economic development at destination? What about ethnicity composition? I have data on the ethnic homeland, and the majority of the migration happened within the homelands, and 68% of the migration happened within the same province, right? And there is a section in the paper where I explore all these aspects, and as well the potential of marriage decision, how it could affect the migration and so on. And as well, I look at the return migration, how it could affect. Then as well, I look at the matching of rooms, indeed, how they match. There is an age gap, there is an education gap, they are getting married with those that were also displaced, and so all these things. The divorce is not very common in Indonesia, but I have data on first, second, and every marriage, right? So I can look at this. That's a good suggestion. And thanks for all. I mean, all makes super sense. And about the welfare implications, I saw as well that it's suboptimal, and it seems that at the end they do not cope with the shock. They end up with an early fertility as well. They end up with a low labor integration, and the household, they do not cope at all in terms of consumption or in terms of expenditure, right? And I saw this in the paper, but maybe I should present slightly in the presentation. And then about the matrilocal, yeah, the thing is that the Indonesia Family Life Survey is only in some of the provinces. It's representative of the 83% of the entire Indonesia population, but is not covering some of the provinces where matrilocal is a prevalent practice. So far in my sample, only 5% practice matrilocal, right? But indeed, even this small sample, we see this striking effect, right? So it's something that I would like to further explore. And the remittances, there is data on that, but about the potential international migration, cross-border migration, only 0.5% of these households migrate outside the Indonesia after earthquake, right? But there could be one of the channels indeed of some remittances from the origin and so on. And about heterogeneity by education, I saw as well that indeed the education is an important component. In which sense? In the payment they receive, that as you stressed, right? So bride price women, they are more attractive. So they invest in this education. As a consequence, they are more educated, right? And the same with the matrilocality, right? So all that you said are pretty correct, and I saw in the paper. And the external validity. So why I'm using Earthquake is because I wanted a shock that allowed me to look at migration and marriage market. And Earthquake is plausibly an exogenous shock. As you said, this is all about the effect of migration. But however, I cannot claim the causal effect of migration on marriage. That's why I only end up looking at the heterogeneity. So my project started, as you said, that is, this is all about displacement. But then, of course, I saw this positive relationship with the ground shaking, negative relationship with the distance to the epicenter, but there might be many unobservables that I cannot control. So then I just simply do it as a heterogeneity, at least for the job market. Then I don't know how things will change. And then for about men, I use it as a placebo group, and we find that there is no effect about men. It's not affected by Earthquake, and we cannot find this heterogeneity. And this is an evidence that indeed women are highly affected, but also it's a mechanism for the bride price, because this is a payment from the groom to the bride. And our groom is the groom who is also credit constrained and is going to be engaged in this payment, right? But they do not receive.
Right, just to clarify, so if someone marries earlier rather than later, then his partner automatically also marries earlier rather than later. So I think there should be automatically an effect on men, just not from the origin. So if these are men at the destination, so it means that at destination men are marrying earlier, right?
Not necessarily, because
No?
Males can be
Lucas.
older, no?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. So
But
in general,
men would also marry later otherwise, right? So I'm just trying to wrap my head about, right, whatever.
No, that's a fair point, and I'm super happy to clarify. So indeed, marriage below 18 is affecting women for many aspects. So we could think about bargaining power, we could think about the role of men in the economy, we can think about the self-decision making process, but in general, early marriage is not, or marriage below the age of 18 is not affecting men. So what I saw when I presented this slide about the marriage market in Indonesia is that by the age of 23, 81% of women are married versus only a 51% of men, right? So you see here the gender gap. So normally, I mean, looking at the matching, we see a huge age gap, right? One important or quite relevant age gap. But with this displacement, it's even larger, right? So we see that it exacerbates as well the matching process, right? And yes, so about the life trajectories as well. Yeah, I have data after the migration and after the marriage. So it's things that I could do it, but the paper is already quite long, so I need to condense and to prioritize things. But there are many things that I can do in the future, of course. But thank you so much for the comments. I strongly appreciate it. I'm very looking forward to have the slides as well.
Yes, I think you can close it, and then we can keep with the questions. Elsa.
All right. Great. So we hope to see you in 2 weeks.